This morning's reading is taken from Matthew 8, verses 1 to 4. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them."
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you in person today, but I am very privileged to be able to speak about this story that we've just heard read from Matthew chapter 8. So this is the second week in a series called At the Heart of It All. And it's a series that talks about the heart of God that's revealed in Jesus Christ. It's not a series that talks about what Jesus has done. It's a series that talks about his motivation for what he's done. The heart of God revealed in Jesus. And last week we were looking from Matthew 11, how Jesus was always talking about our hearts and how he viewed them as the command and control center of our lives. But only in one place in 89 chapters of the Gospels does Jesus talk about his own heart. And in Matthew 11 verse 29 he says, "For I am humble and gentle of heart," or lowly and meek. Those words all mean the same. And we get this surprising kind of lifting of the curtain as to the motivating force of the heart of God revealed in Jesus. That he's gentle, lowly, meek, and humble. And last week we saw how, whatever else that means, it doesn't mean that he's a pushover. It doesn't mean that he's kind of mushy. In the same passage it talks about how there will inevitably be judgment for those who refuse God, where God eventually says to us, well, okay, have it your own way, and we're excluded from him forever. But the wonderful heart of Jesus was revealed in that passage in Matthew 11, where Jesus simply says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest for your souls." And so we started last week looking at the heart of Jesus, the heart of God revealed in Jesus. And this week in Matthew chapter 8, what Jesus said in words in Matthew 11 verse 29, he now demonstrates with his actions in Matthew chapter 8. So come with me, use your imaginations, imagine this story with me. And so we enter into a world that doesn't exist anymore, so that we can grasp its principles to live differently in the world that exists now. That's what we're doing as we come to this story about the life of Jesus. So it's the end of the day. The text doesn't say that. I'm just imagining that in my mind, because it does say that Jesus has been teaching. He's been delivering the Sermon on the Mount. And I imagine that Jesus is weary, because I know that public speaking makes you tired. And he gets to the end of his talk and he wants to go off and have some R&R, and he comes down the hill. But the crowds, they can't get enough of this Jesus, so they follow him. And in that dynamic, as the teaching session is over, Jesus is trying to put some distance between him and the crowds, but the crowds are following. It's in that moment that the story unfolds. And it says there in chapter 8 verse 2, a man with leprosy came and knelt before Jesus and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Let's just clarify a couple of things. First of all, this man was very, very seriously ill. William Barclay described leprosy in a chilling phrase. He said it was the disease which killed people an inch at a time. And basically it was a disease of the nervous system which made people completely oblivious to pain. And so they did terrible damage to themselves and slowly killed themselves a digit at a time, a limb at a time, because of course pain protects the natural human body, and when you don't have any pain indicators, you do terrible damage to your body. And of course the muscles would waste away, and the hands and feet would get twisted up, and it was just a terrible disease. And not only was this man very seriously physically ill, he also carried with him this terrible spiritual stigma. To the religious Jew, this man was not just ill, he was morally and spiritually unclean. And there were very specific instructions in the Old Testament about how leprosy was to be dealt with. And for those of us who have spent the last 18 months wearing masks, just imagine what this was like as I read to you from Leviticus 13. Anyone who was suspected of having this disease, and if they were found to be infected, it was said this of them: the leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of their head hang loose. They shall cover up their upper lip, and cry, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as they have the disease. They are unclean. They shall live alone. Their dwelling place should be outside the camp. Leprosy was incurable. It was viewed as contagious, and it led to this idea that a person wasn't just physically ill, they were spiritually unclean. And the Old Testament purity laws were all about keeping people clean. And so a leper was seen just one step above a dead body as something that the spiritually pure must keep away from, that they would be defiled by. And so a leper wasn't allowed to come within 6 feet of another human being, even their family. And it basically meant that lepers in the end lived on their own in these isolated communities. It was a dehumanizing disease. But I want you to notice 3 things about the leper in verse 2. The first thing is that this man worshipped Jesus. We're told that his immediate response is he gets down on his knees. And the word translated for kneeling there is only ever used really of a human being in the presence of one they view as divine. There is an element of worship just involved in the kneeling. But to add to that, the man calls Jesus Lord, which was the Greek translation of the Old Testament Hebrew word Yahweh, which is the holy name for God. And so both in his actions and in his words, this leper starts by worshipping Jesus. The second thing that's really admirable about this man with leprosy is that he clearly has faith in the power of Jesus. He doesn't doubt for a moment that Jesus could heal him. He simply says, if you are willing. The leper seems to have no doubt about the ability of Jesus to heal. His only question was about his willingness to do it. And the third thing is that the man infers in his words that he knows he needs more than physical healing. Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean, he says. This leper sought more than healing. He wanted cleansing, not only from the leprosy, but from all of its terrible effects on his life. And so here you have this man very, very seriously ill, who actually is a great example of worship, of faith, and recognizing his need for the touch of God. And so verse 2, it's the man with leprosy who's been the focus of attention, but then the attention in the story switches to verse 3, and by now the crowd are kind of gathering around, watching this very unusual interaction where a man with leprosy who was supposed to keep his distance from the crowds is now in the middle of the crowd. You can imagine everybody standing back, giving this leper space, because that was what they were trained to do. In verse 3, the attention focuses on Jesus, and his response is really quite dramatic. Then Jesus put out his hand touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed, and immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Jesus put out his hand and touched him. Before he touched him, the man had leprosy. After he touched him, he no longer had leprosy. Jesus didn't have to touch him. He healed other people just with words. He healed some people not by even being there. But he touched him. Why did he do that? Well, when everybody else was stepping back, Jesus stepped forward. It's deeply symbolic. I think it was partly to show the crowds. My guess too, it was partly for this man. How many years had it been since anybody had touched him? And so in this deeply symbolic gesture, both of love for the man and challenge to the crowd, Jesus touches him and heals him. And it's really interesting what happens in verse 4, immediately after this remarkable healing, because Jesus then has to manage his own situation and the situation of the leper. So this is all about miracle management in verse 4. Because you see, the Jews had this expectation that God was one day going to send a Messiah, and the Messiah was going to be a military kind of revolt leader who would defeat the Romans and free them from the occupation under Roman rule. And one of the things the Jews expected the Messiah to do was to work miracles. So Jesus did not work miracles for some kind of celebrity. In fact, working miracles, whilst it was essential to demonstrate that the kingdom of God was breaking in through what he was saying and doing, was also a real problem to him, because he knew that people would associate it with him being the Messiah and think he was there to lead a revolt. And so he says, to manage his own situation, he says, don't go and tell anybody about this. The trouble was that not only had the crowd witnessed it, but also Mark's gospel tells us that the man immediately went and told everybody. So Jesus couldn't do any more in that area because it was too problematic and he had to move on to somewhere else. So Jesus was trying to manage his own situation, but I'm really intrigued about how he tried to manage, or he did manage, the man with leprosy's situation. Because he says, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. So in Leviticus 14, there were some rules about what needed to happen if anybody felt they had been healed of leprosy. And so they would have to go to the priest and they would have to offer sacrifices. I would imagine it was something that very, very rarely happened. And Jesus says to this guy, look, I want you to go to the priest. Now, why is Jesus saying that? Well, it's because Jesus knew that cleansing for this leper was more than being physically healed of leprosy. You imagine what it's been like to go around for years going unclean, unclean, living in isolation. Imagine what that does. It's not just your body that's ravaged with disease, but you've become isolated socially, you've been damaged psychologically, you've been cut off spiritually, and going to the priest was a deeply restorative act. It was not only celebrating the fact that this man with leprosy had been healed, but it was also restoring his humanity. He's been so dehumanized by this disease that now he's being rehumanized. He's being put back in his community, in his family, where the social and moral and spiritual stigma that he's lived with for years is now gone, and he can start afresh. It's a beautiful story. I want you to notice a couple of things. Notice first of all how Jesus fulfills the Old Testament law. Jesus had said in Matthew 5, he said, I've come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And Jesus has this complex relationship with the Old Testament law. And so how does he fulfill it in this story? Well, first of all, it seems that he fulfills it by breaking the law. People were supposed to keep away from lepers. Jesus touches this man with leprosy. So he fulfills the law by breaking it. And then the second thing he does is he reverses the law. He fulfills the law by reversing it. Now, this is a really interesting thing in the Old Testament. Purity laws in the Old Testament were a big deal. A devout Jew needed to keep themselves pure. And there were all sorts of sacrifices to keep you pure. You didn't get pure by washing. It wasn't about dirt on the outside. It was about sin on the inside. And so there were sacrifices to keep you pure. But the whole premise of the Old Testament was that if somebody who was a devout, pure follower of Jesus was in contact with someone who was defiled, then the contagion, the defilement, the sin would always impact the pure person. You know, the default assumption was that if you had contact with someone who was sick, someone who was a dead body, someone who was a sinner, you know, you were defiled. That's why Jesus got in so much trouble for eating with sinners and tax collectors, because the assumption of Jewish law is that Jesus would no longer be pure because he was defiled. It was a one-way street in the Old Testament. The impure or impure always compromise the pure. What we see in this story is that principle completely reversed, where Jesus is being described as God's Son. Jesus is being described as the Holy One. Jesus is being described as the most pure person that has ever lived. And when he reaches out and touches the leper, he's not contaminated. His purity brings purity to the leper. And so the whole of that expectation of the Old Testament purity laws is completely reversed in this story. It's wonderful. So Jesus fulfills the law by breaking it, by reversing it, but then actually saying to the leper himself, actually, you need to go and see the priest. You need to obey the law from Leviticus 14 so that the man can be restored. This is by no means the last word on Jesus' complicated relationship with the Old Testament law. But I'm intrigued that when Jesus said, I have not come to abolish the law but to fulfill it, he does so in this story by breaking it, reversing it, and then obeying it. Go figure. Now, the second thing I want you to notice here is that this story powerfully reveals the heart of God revealed in Jesus. The leper says to him, if you are willing, and Jesus says, I am willing. This word will, this referring to the deepest desire of the heart of Jesus. What was revealed in this healing, this cleansing, was the deepest desire of the heart of Jesus. What we see Jesus claiming with his words in Matthew 11, we see him demonstrating with his actions in Matthew chapter 8. And here's the point. If the actions of Jesus reflect who he most deeply is, then we cannot escape this idea that Jesus is drawn towards our brokenness, our shame, our guilt, our sin. It's our very fallenness and brokenness that Jesus is drawn to, reversing all the Old Testament expectations of what holiness looked like. Jesus moves towards the leper and brings his cleansing power. My eldest son and my brother have both had the experience of saving somebody's life. They have both been in situations where somebody was literally choking to death. They were choking on something, they were losing consciousness, they were asphyxiating, and the normal kind of slap on the back technique wasn't working. And so both of them performed, obviously different times, different places, but performed the Heinrich maneuver. You never guess the name of the person who designed it. But anyway, the Heinrich maneuver is where you get your fist under the ribcage of someone and pull them upwards. And they have both been involved in a situation. My brother in a restaurant with somebody on another table choking to death, and just performing that maneuver and saving their lives. Now, talking to them afterwards, you know, there was a sense of kind of trauma about the event. It was a very dramatic moment in their lives. But afterwards, there was a massive sense of not just relief, but of of satisfaction, of privilege. You know, both of them had done first aid training, and that training, you know, had been put into practice, and it had worked, and they'd saved someone's life. And there was a sense of pride about what they'd done, and rightly so. There was a sense of delight about it. And I use that story to try and reflect what we're seeing about the heart of God revealed in Jesus here. And, you know, this is why Jesus came. Jesus came to save us. And so often we feel like the thing that excludes us from the love of Jesus, that kind of puts us off limits to a holy God. We forget that actually this is why he came. That Jesus revealed in this story, pure and holy though he is, moves towards brokenness, moves towards sinfulness, moves towards those situations which need his cleansing and healing power. He embraces them. Now, the Jesus of the Gospels can never be underestimated. Jesus is the fulfillment of everything the Old Testament looked forward to. Jesus is so holy and perfect that even his friends fell down in fear and awe at his holiness. Jesus taught like one with supreme authority. There's never been anyone before or since who taught with his wisdom and genius and insight. And he was a miracle worker. Through Jesus, the perfection of the future was ushered into the brokenness of the present with transforming power. To say anything less of Jesus is to be unfaithful to all that the Bible teaches. But at the heart of who he is, there is this movement towards broken people, to sufferers, to sinners. He touches, heals, embraces, forgives from the heart, from the very core of his being. For he says, I am gentle and humble and lowly and meek. He comes to redeem and to rescue us. It wasn't so much that Jesus did loving things. It was more that he did things that reflected his heart of love. That Jesus is love. That, as Dane Ortland says in his book, Gentle and Lowly, which is the basis of this sermon series in a book that I recommend to everyone, he simply says, it is impossible to exaggerate the love of God revealed in Christ Jesus. So what do we do with this wonderful story? As we've imagined this crowd, we've imagined this beautiful interaction, we can imagine Jesus trying to manage his situation and the lepers after this miracle. And after we've reflected on all that was going on there, we step out of history and we step into now and say, okay, so how does this impact your life and mine today? How do we live out this story? How do the principles of what happened 2,000 years ago in first century Palestine inform the way you and I live today? Here are just a couple of things to finish with. The first thing is this: that which you are most ashamed of is the very thing that draws Jesus towards you. That which you are most ashamed of is the very thing that draws Jesus towards you. Jesus reversed all the instincts of the Old Testament understanding of holiness, and the most pure and holy person who has ever lived moved towards contagion, moved towards disease, moved towards sinfulness and brokenness and being ostracized and isolated, and touched him with healing and cleansing. This is the heart of God revealed in Jesus Christ. He moves towards the broken. And this is wonderful news for all of us who carry around that horrible secret shame that we hope nobody else will never know about us. It's that very thing which draws Jesus towards us, because that's why he came. Now that's wonderful for those of us who believe in guilt and sin and shame and those kind of things. But for increasing numbers of people in our culture right now, that's an entirely alien concept. And the way our culture deals with this is to work. This is a kind of summary of where many, especially the emerging generations in our culture, this is an example of the way they think. So there is no God, and if there is no God, then that makes me my own final authority. And if there is no God, then there's no right or wrong. So if I'm my own final authority, I've got to be true to who I am. And the only way I know to be true to who I am is to go along with how I feel in the moment. To be someone who does what I feel in the moment is to be truthful to who I am. And if over time I look back and think, okay, the way I acted then, although it was governed by my feelings, is a mistake, it hurt other people, it damaged me, somehow I've got to come to terms with that. And I've got to wrap that up into my identity so that actually I shouldn't feel shame because I'm the centre of my life. So it doesn't matter if I've really damaged myself and made terrible mistakes and hurt those I love. That somehow has to be something I wrap around into myself. And you have to accept me with faults and all, because it's almost a badge of honour now, my brokenness, because that is who I am. And because I'm the centre of the universe, you've got to accept me as I am. And that's the way our culture is increasingly thinking, that there is no guilt, there is no shame. It's just, I am. If you are someone who is listening to this and you think that kind of way, all I would say to you is this: you really aren't on your own. The idea that we all have to embrace our mistakes and failures and somehow still live a peaceful, joyful, happy life, that's actually impossible. But you're not on your own. There is a God, and his name is Jesus. And he says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest for your souls. The freedom of forgiveness, the lightening of the load when we know that we can start again, is an incredible experience that the God who made us longs for us to experience. We are not on our own. And so the first thing from this story is that that which we're most ashamed of is the very thing that draws Jesus towards us. The last thing to finish with this morning is this. It's the example of the leper himself. If you want to come to Jesus this morning, I don't know of a better example of this man who had leprosy. He fell on his knees and he called Jesus Lord. He had faith in his power. He said, if you're willing. And he knew that his need was more than physical healing. Lord, I need your cleansing. This is a great example of how we are to come to Jesus with that same worshipful attitude, with that same trust in his power, and recognizing that we have more that we need him to do in us than simply what we're asking him initially, that we need his transforming power in all our lives. But the thing that impresses me most about him is that I wonder whether the man with leprosy wasn't just an example to us, but actually became an example to Jesus himself. Think about it. Less than 3 years later, Jesus is in Gethsemane. The terror and the horror of the cross is hovering over him. He is about to embrace upon himself all the shame and the isolation that this man with leprosy had experienced. He knew that he was going to the cross. He knew that Jewish law said that anybody who was crucified was cursed by God. All of that isolation and stigma that the man with leprosy had experienced, Jesus was about to take upon himself. And there in Gethsemane, on his own, what does he do? He gets down on his knees. He worships his Father. He too does what the leper says and trusts God for his power, but recognizes his will is something else. And he says, Lord, take this cup, Father, take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours be done. And the terrible, horrifying thing is that God revealed his heart in Jesus. And Jesus said, I am willing, to the leper. But when in Gethsemane, Jesus cried out to his Father, God was not willing. He said nothing. No wonder Jesus cried from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's only with the benefit of hindsight now that we know why. Jesus said no. The Father said no to his Son Jesus because he wanted to say yes to us. The Father said he wasn't willing to Jesus because the Father didn't want what happened to the man with leprosy to be a one-off event of history, but the lived experience of you and me and everyone. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The Father said no to the Son so that he could offer life and rehumanizing to all of us. And for that incredible act of love, really, all words are inadequate.